I picked 10 composers and pieces here that I believe can be seen as radically ahead of their time. I'm assuming you'll know a few of these characters, but I'm sure there'll also be a few you're perhaps less aware of, even some I'll be introducing you to for the first time. We'll travel all the way from the 12th century to a composer alive and working today. First though, a quick disclaimer, these choices are particularly subjective. Composers don't necessarily have time machines that allow them to see into the future, so these things are all constructed retrospectively. As Georges-Louis Borges once said, the fact is that every writer creates their own precursors. Their work modifies our conception of the past, as it will modify the future. First up is Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century composer described by Peter Bronca as daunting, eccentric, and stupendous in her powers of expression. At the time, music was considered the highest form of human activity, and so much of Hildegard's composing was an extension of other aspects of her intellectual life, as well as Christianity. Her music is similar to the Gregorian chants popular in Europe at the time, yet strikingly unique and original. Gramophone magazine describes her Canticles of Ecstasy as an ever-flowing, rapturous outpouring of melody. This is Carlo Gesualdo's Si la mia morte brami from his 6th book of Madrigals written in 1611, but you might not have guessed that. The music is really quite chromatic, raising and lowering voices as a kind of expressive brightening and darkening, and in the process using lots of strange notes. For example, the 17th madrigal, translating as I die languishing of grief, opens with the descending chords C sharp major, A minor, B major, and G major. These chords on their own would suggest some kind of Wagnerian progression, centuries ahead of its time, but the fact is the writing is still modal, with these chromatic sounds simply expressing the meaning of the text, a descent into despair. Regardless, it's a very characterful musical language for the time. Extended techniques and polytonality, using multiple keys at once, are often considered the domain of contemporary pieces, but this 17th century composer might change your mind. Battalia 10 is one of Heinrich Biber's most famous pieces, a programmatic battle piece which features all kinds of quirky and unusual techniques. These include the col legno string technique, bouncing the wood of the bow off the strings. A collage of tunes in 7 different keys, imitating the singing of drunk sailors. And even a piece of paper placed underneath the double bass's strings to create a snare drum sound. Genius. When Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring premiered in 1913, it nearly incited a riot, especially when the curtain rose on this particularly famous scene and chord. The dissonant clashing sound is the result of the stacking of 2 completely separate chords, an F-flat major and E-flat dominant 7th, much like Biber did with different keys in Battalia. Compare that though with this chord, a very dissonant cluster of notes from the opening of Jean-Frey Rebel's Les Elemens, written over 175 years earlier. Rebel was definitely a little quirky, but this strikingly expressive piece, depicting the chaos during the creation of the world, is definitely worth a listen. speaking of unusual chords, what about this one? This is the Tristan chord from Wagner's 1859 opera Tristan and Isolde. The chord itself isn't particularly exciting, spelling a half-diminished seventh chord common in lots of different styles, but what's odd is the context in which the chord appears, particularly its lack of conventional resolution. The chord seems to never go where you want it to, just as Tristan and Isolde can never truly be together. In fact, the chord was so groundbreaking, it went on to influence a whole sway of composers, from film composer Bernard Herrmann to Mahler, and even appears as a slapstick reference in this miniature by Debussy. Regardless, it's a brilliant sound that's widely cited as a landmark in the development of Western music. This Bagatelle by the Hungarian composer Franz Liszt at first doesn't seem so out of place. Written in 1885, the Bagatelle without tonality is a very typical waltz form, and not particularly dissonant. What you will notice as the piece goes on though, is that with extremely chromatic progressions, Liszt creates a constantly shifting sense of key. The piece also has a particularly strange ending, finishing with a very unnerving upward rushing of diminished seventh chords, an ambiguous and unsettling sound. It's an interesting piece which seems to preempt the abandoning of conventional tonality by some composers a few decades later. Charles Ives' music is definitely challenging at times, with its colliding marching bands and endless overlaying of popular tunes, but at its core, his work is really all about memories. Working in insurance on Wall Street gave him the freedom to write whatever he liked, creating some of the most boldly original music, arguably ever, combining completely contradictory elements, often all in separate keys. Though his music is full of gags and good times though, there's also a very genuine sentimentality in his work. For example, Washington's Birthday from his Holidays Symphony begins with these very icy, wintry chords, before erupting into this barn dance. After this very strange musical dream of sorts, the music then drops back to this very soothing hymnal tune, whilst in the distance, a fiddle player practices on the step of the porch, though, of course, in a totally different key. It's truly amazing to think that this piece was written over 100 years ago, but it really was. Written around the same time, Schoenberg's Farben from his 5 pieces for orchestra actually predates the 12-tone technique he became so well known for. In fact, Schoenberg pretty much strips away all melodic and harmonic interest, instead focusing in on the sonic manipulation of a single chord, the Farben chord. The chord is scored for a constantly changing array of sounds and colours, with Schoenberg himself adding, "The conductor need not try to polish sounds which seem unbalanced, but watch that every instrumentalist plays accurately the prescribed dynamic. There are no motives in this piece which have to be brought to the fore." Farben's obsession with instrumental colours and timbre can be said to preempt the spectral movement, which used the acoustic properties of sound as a basis for composition, and didn't appear until some 60 years later. English composer Gustav Holst attended the world premiere of 5 Pieces for Orchestra, and echoes of the piece later appeared in his Planet Suite, completed in 1916. The suite features 7 movements inspired by the astrological identities of the planets of the solar system, with lots of groundbreaking features. For example, in Saturn, Holst makes use of the bass oboe, a very unusual woodwind instrument. In Mercury, there's a very blatant use of bitonality, 2 keys at once, particularly the tritone-related keys of E and B-flat major. And finally, you can't forget the hypnotic fade-out ending of Neptune, where the door is slowly closed on a female chorus positioned off stage. The suite became a huge source of inspiration for many Hollywood composers, including John Williams, particularly in Star Wars. For example, compare this excerpt from Star Wars with this passage from the opening movement of the planet, Mars. Probably taking the Clone Wars a little too literally. I think I'll make another video on some of the more groundbreaking composers from the latter half of the 20th century. So instead, now let's skip ahead to today, in particular to the violist, singer and composer Caroline Shaw. Shaw originally burst onto the scene back in 2013, when her piece Partita for 8 Voices won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm including this piece in this list, not just because of its wide range of influences, from pop to a type of Inuit throat singing, but because, as Justin Davidson writes, it discovers the rarest commodity in contemporary music: joy. It's very rare that a single piece can unify so many disparate elements and traditions, but Partita for 8 Voices does it with relative ease. It's a truly standout piece of work by, in my opinion, one of the most exciting composers alive and working today. So those are my choices. What do you think? Do any other pieces and composers spring to mind? Do let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.